Thank you so much for coming here and joining us tonight. Welcome to the Center for Urban Engagement's first lecture of the year, which we have the pleasure of co-hosting with the Business and Economics Department. My name is Krista Tooley, and I direct the Center for Urban Engagement, an academic center of Wheaton College which exists to promote just, sustainable, and flourishing urban communities through the academic study of cities and transformational experiences of urban life. The research of our invited speaker here tonight, Dr. James Sullivan, speaks very closely to CUE's interest in facilitating evidence-based discussion on issues relating to inequality and justice. And I would suggest also to the concerns of all Christians who, in reading our Bibles, have discovered Christ's call to respond to the suffering caused by poverty. In tonight's lecture, How We Have Fared, How America Has Fared on its War on Poverty, Dr. Sullivan will address the effectiveness of national programs designed to reduce poverty over the last 5 decades and identify for us key insights about what works and what doesn't in this long and worthy project. And so I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker, Dr. James Sullivan, who is the Gilbert F. Schaefer College Professor of Economics at Notre Dame University and co-founder of LEO, the Wilson Sheehan Lab for Economic Opportunity, which is a research center that works with service providers and policymakers to identify effective and scalable solutions to reduce poverty in America. Dr. Sullivan serves on the National Poverty Center Advisory Board and is a member of the U.S. Commission on Social Impact Partnerships. In addition to an extensive publication record in top economics journals, Dr. Sullivan has written for the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and CNN, and his research has been cited not only in these publications, but also by Forbes, the New York Times, the BBC, and many, many more. We are so grateful to have Dr. Sullivan here this evening to speak to us about the war on poverty. Will you please join me in welcoming Dr. James Sullivan.
Thank you, Krista. And thanks to you all for taking time out of your Thursday nights to hear a little bit about the war on poverty. So I thought I would start by telling you a little bit about this war, because some of you might not even know that we were part of it. And when I say I'm going to give you a quick history of America's longest war, you might say, I didn't know we were going to talk about Afghanistan tonight. And because they often talk about Afghanistan as their longest war, right? But in fact, we've been fighting a war on poverty that was officially called the War on Poverty over 55 years ago. And just to give you a really quick history on that, back in 1964, Lyndon Johnson, in his State of the Union address, formally declared a war on poverty in the United States. And in this address, he talked about how he was going to address many of the social concerns at the time: a lack of health insurance, a lack of resources to put food on the table, a lack of housing. And what followed after this State of the Union address was a series of legislation that led to some of the most expansive social policy that we had seen since Franklin Delano Roosevelt after the Great Depression. And many of the programs that we see that are part of the safety net today came out of this initiative, the War on Poverty, that Johnson declared. For example, shortly after Johnson declared the War on Poverty, we launched the food stamps program, which provides subsidies for people to purchase and afford food. The Head Start program to ensure that young kids have access to school, housing assistance, Medicaid, which was health insurance for the poor, and then a decade or so later, we started to redistribute resources through the tax system in the form of the earned income tax credits. There are many different programs that were part of this war. And what was going on behind the scenes here was that Johnson administration said, we're going to declare this war on poverty. We better be able to tell people whether or not we've won the war. So he instructed his Council of Economic Advisors to come up with a measure of poverty, because we didn't have a measure of poverty, and we needed a baseline. Like, where are we when we start, so that once we declare this war after we're done, we better be better off, right? And so the Council of Economic Advisors got together and they came up with a pretty crude measure of poverty that just so happened to come out to a nice round number of 20%, right? So 20% of the country was poor, declared poor in 1964. They then said, we need to have a real kind of formal measure of poverty. So they called a woman by the name of Meyer over in the Social Security Administration and said, we're going to need to come up with a measure of poverty, and it should probably come up to be around 20%, because that's the number that our council decided was the baseline. And so Molly did something, I guess, pretty reasonable at the time. She came up with a poverty measure that compared, you were poor if your resources, your family pre-tax income, fell below a threshold. And so then the key was to decide what is that threshold. And so the way she came up with the threshold, because it is inherently arbitrary, what you decide, like below this line you're poor and above this line you're not poor, right? So Molly Orshansky had to decide that. And so what she did is she went over to the USDA, and they had been calculating what it costs. How much money do you need to have like a minimally nutritious diet? And they were calculating that number for families, for a single individuals, family of 2, 3, 4, etc. And Molly then took data from a survey on how people spend their money and calculated that families spend about a third of their budget back in the 1960s, a third of their budget on food. So she took the thrifty food plan from the USDA, multiplied it by 3, and those became our poverty thresholds in 1964. And the only thing we've done to change Molly's approach since then is to take those thresholds and move them up to account for inflation every year. Otherwise, we have the same definition of poverty that Molly came up with back in 1964. And just to give you a sense of what that is, for a single individual today, that would be a little over $13,000 is the line that your pre-tax money income would have to fall below in order for you to be considered poor. For 2 adult, 2 family, the poverty threshold is a little over $26,000. So that's where we started off. A simple question: if we've been fighting a war for 55 years, and this is a long time ago, did we win? Or at least, have we been winning? And it turns out that the answer to that question is pretty hard to answer, or at least hard to come up with a conclusion if you go read into it, right? You'll probably come across many people who will say, we have lost the war. So this is on the 50th anniversary of the War on Poverty. So back in 2014, the New York Times posted this article, 50 years later, the war on poverty is a mixed bag. And to many Americans, the war on poverty declared 50 years ago has largely failed. Right? And this wasn't the opinion of the New York Times, it's the opinion shared by many. On what are they basing this? Right? Well, they're basing it on Molly Orshansky's results, or poverty measure. So this is the official poverty rate every year since we started calculating it. So up to, I'm going to cut it off before we head into a pandemic. That's a different lecture for tomorrow. But so we'll stop in 2018. This is the poverty rate. So we started off when we declared the war, we're at 19%, was Molly Orshansky's measure, just under with the Council of Economic Advisors came on. Made a little bit of progress in the early 60s, but really the programs didn't get put into place until the mid to late 60s. How have we done since then? Well, not so well. So much so that in 1988, when Ronald Reagan had in his State of the Union address, his last State of the Union address, he said, we've declared a war on poverty and poverty won. Okay. Why did Ronald Reagan say that? Well, he was pointing to a poverty rate in 1988 of 13% that was actually 2 percentage points higher than it was in the early 70s. So we've gone, nearly 2 decades, and we've made no progress. If anything, we've regressed, according to the official poverty measure. Right? How have we done since Reagan's State of the Union address? Well, if you go all the way to 2018, we're at 11.8%. Right? And you don't have to go back a few years, and we were higher than we were in 1988. Incidentally, last week, if you're following that, they released the official poverty measure for 2020 was 11.4%. So using these kinds of statistics, many have argued that we've lost the war on poverty. And the argument usually goes something like, why are we spending $1 trillion a year fighting poverty if we're not making any progress towards reducing poverty? Right? Let's admit we've lost the war and change the strategy is oftentimes the way the argument goes. And so here's an example of this. This is from the Cato Institute, a think tank in DC that said, American welfare state, we spend $1 trillion a year fighting poverty, and we failed. And so the obvious conclusion is we should stop spending that money. So, as you might guess, the story is not that simple, and so I'm going to convince you that they're actually, they've been misled a little bit in terms of or quite a bit in terms of what's happened to poverty. And mainly it's because there's lots of flaws with the official poverty measure, and there's in fact there are National Academy of Science reports that are several hundred pages long that talk about the flaws in the official poverty measure. Most of them focus on things that don't matter that much, like how we adjust for families of different sizes. But there's a couple of things that matter a lot, and they're very intuitive. And so I'm going to share with you the two most substantive flaws that really change the way we think about whether or not we've won the war on poverty. The first is adjusting for inflation. Okay, so remember I said that the only thing we've done with Meyer-Shansky's measure is raise those thresholds over time to account for inflation. So adjusting for inflation is the first, and the second is how we measure resources. I kept saying this awkward pre-tax money income. Turns out that definition is really important. So let's talk about both of these. The first one, adjusting for inflation. Now this one, I know this is an interdisciplinary crowd, but even amongst economists, like talking about bias in inflation adjustment can be a pretty complicated lecture, but to get the idea of the importance of adjusting for inflation doesn't need to be complicated. So I was trying to think about how do I convey this to an interdisciplinary audience that might not be experts in consumer price index. And then I realized probably the best way to do it would be to talk about this guy. Raise your hand if you know who this is. Yes. Who is it? Or why is he famous? For missing, yes. And what was you were just Cody Parkey, yeah. And he's famous for missing the double doink, right? So he missed a field goal and to lose a playoff game, and he had already hit the uprights many times during the season. And this one, he actually hit the upright and the crossbar, and it didn't really. My point, why is Cody Parkey? This is actually not directly Cody Parkey or this particular play. But I was doing some research on kickers in the NFL. And in doing that research, I came to the conclusion that kickers have gotten worse over time. Okay? And you might think, don't you think the opposite has happened? Let me just give you the data. Here is the fraction of point after attempts that are successful in the NFL over time. And look, they were at 99%. They were making every one of their field goals or extra points until more recently, and we've just seen this sharp drop off. So kickers have gotten worse. Right? Who's not convinced? All right, give me an alternative explanation.
I have a great explanation.
Don't explain. You don't believe me.
I don't believe it.
You don't believe the data. It just couldn't happen. Yeah, you have an alternative explanation?
They moved it back, right?
They moved it back. They moved the goalpost. Right? In 2015, they moved it from 20 yards for an extra point. They didn't move the goalpost. They moved where you kick it. I like that. They moved the goalpost. They moved it from 20 yards to 33 yards. And guess what happens when you make it further, right? It's harder to be successful. Right? This is exactly what's happening with inflation bias in our official poverty measure. They moved the goalpost. They took the poverty line and they moved it up. And therefore, it's harder to get over the poverty line. And so, as a result, we have more people that are calculated as poor, right? And so we're understating the success we're having as a result of poverty. I can show you that. Actually, putting this to what they actually do with poverty, we use the CPIs, the Consumer Price Index, to adjust thresholds upward over time. And this isn't something that I've just kind of concluded on my own. There's a long, very large literature about CPI bias that we know that over time it was overstating inflation. In fact, the Bureau of Labor Statistics that generates the CPI acknowledged this and then made corrections to it. And they haven't fully adjusted for the bias, but they made many corrections and adjusted to many. But they don't go back and change the poverty thresholds. So even though we know we got it wrong, we don't go back to change it. And that has to do with kind of the political complications with the official poverty rate. It's a hard thing to change. But so what you can do though is recognizing in the literature that there is this bias, we can easily incorporate that into a poverty measure. So the green line is the official poverty thresholds. I'm just going to start in 1980. Take Meyer-Shansky's thresholds in 1980 and then just adjust them over time using the CPI. So that is these green thresholds right here, right? Each year it tells you the threshold. So in 2018, it was a little over $25,000 for a family. This is for a family of 4, right? If I were to incorporate the price index bias into my price index and then take those same thresholds and adjust them over time, it would be this blue line, right? And so this is what I mean. What they've done is they've moved, this would be a accurately adjusted threshold, and we're going to just move the goalpost back, right, by adjusting it too much. And as a result, it turns out that year to year, if you look at the change in the last year or two in these thresholds versus that doesn't make much of a difference. But when you look over 50 years and you try to draw conclusions like, have we won the war on poverty? It turns out to matter a lot. So adjusting for inflation is important. The other one I mentioned is resources. And I kept saying this phrase, pre-tax money income. So what Meyer-Shansky did was compare the pre-tax money income, so that just think of cash income, your earnings predominantly, compared to the threshold. Now that made sense in 1964 because most of your income was pre-tax money income. Right? Particularly if you're at the low end of the distribution, you weren't paying that much in taxes, there really weren't sizable tax credits, and there weren't other resources that were being provided that accounted for a big part of your income. Okay? What pre-tax money income doesn't include is food stamps, the food stamps program, because that is an in-kind voucher, that subsidy that allows you to purchase food at a reduced price. Right? It doesn't include tax credits like the EITC. So today, the federal government redistributes $70 billion through tax credits in the Earned Income Tax Credit. You may have heard a lot about the child tax credit that is being talked about right now. That is not included in the official measure of poverty. Interestingly enough, the stimulus payments that we pay out are actually tax credits. And so they're not accounted in the official poverty measure either, which is, if you heard about the official poverty release, they released 2 numbers because it was very misleading to release it without the stimulus numbers. Housing assistance, Medicaid, Medicare, none of these things are in the measure of resources that you compare to the threshold. Okay? Now that is critically important because those are the things, those were the weapons in the war on poverty. These are the things we expanded, but we're not going to include it when we count how we did in the war on poverty. Right? So that is an important flaw. And that's been well documented, and others have noted, and there's been a lot of talk about and now proposed alternative measures. What we do in this work really is emphasize how important this is for changes over time. Some of these things turn out to be really important to not have in a poverty measure when thinking about changes over time. Others, some are less important, some are really important. Okay, so 2, we have a resource measure, we have an inflation measure. How important are these things? So I'm going to go through a very simple kind of statistical exercise. I'm just going to recalculate poverty rates, fixing these flaws, and show you how much of a difference it makes. So here's official poverty measure from 1962 to 2018. And what I'm going to do is, instead of using Meyer-Shansky's thresholds, I'm going to adjust over time correcting for that bias in the CPI, using kind of the consensus on the side magnitude of the bias in the literature. Now the trick to doing that is that you have to pick a year where my thresholds and Meyer Shansky's are exactly the same, and then I adjust. And so I'm going to pick 1980 because for some of the data I only have it from 1980 going forward. Okay, so in 1980, the poverty rate, I'm going to use the same thresholds, the poverty rate's going to be exactly the same. And then I'm going to adjust those thresholds forward and backwards using a bias-corrected pricing mix. Okay? And then otherwise I'm doing exactly what the census does when it calculates poverty. What ends up happening? Well, first let's remind ourselves what happened. Since 1963 to 2018, poverty declined by 8 percentage points by the official measure. We think that that's evidence of losing the war on poverty because it's really basically flat since the early 70s, right? If you correct for inflation, calculate that same rate, you get the following. So notice that the same in 1980, poverty's going to be higher going backwards, right? Because the thresholds, here we were rising the thresholds faster, and then the poverty rate's going to be lower over here because as these thresholds are growing faster. And what you get over that same period, since 1963, is a 22% percentage point decline in poverty. Right? I don't think anybody would look at this and say we've lost the war on poverty. Right? So just correcting for inflation bias alone changes the overall conclusion from one where we say we've lost the war on poverty to one where we say it looks like we've made quite a bit of progress in terms of the war on poverty. So that's inflation. Now let's think about some of the other factors. So all I did was just take this previous figure and I'm going to just zoom in to 1980 to 2018 because I only have data since 1980 for these other measures of resources. And so let's start with my measure that corrects for inflation bias. And now what I'm going to do is add in the resources. Let's add in food stamps. Let's add in tax credits. Those are the two things that I have housing subsidies. I can get those in the data. I'm going to take your pre-tax money income, add those, and then compare it to the poverty line. Right? And then do that for every year and see what happens. Well, when you do that, so this is I call it a disposable income measure of poverty as opposed to the official income measure. You see that poverty falls by an additional 2 percentage points as a result of having a broader measure of resources. So incorporating resources matters too, a broader measure of resources, not quite as much as accounting for inflation. And to give you a sense of how important this is, a percentage point, think about it as 3 million more individuals out of poverty, right? So over the past, since 1980, so nearly 40 years, the official poverty measure says maybe we've reduced the number of people in poverty by 3 million, and it's closer to 24 million once you take a more comprehensive, accurate picture of this, which changes again the way we think about the effect of the war on poverty efforts on the well-being of the bottom. So that's kind of just thinking about correcting for income and price bias. I want to take this idea of resources a little bit further and think about whether or not income is the right measure we want to be using when we measure poverty in the first place. And many of you who study economics are familiar with this concept because economists, when we write down utility functions for individuals, we oftentimes put consumption in there. What individuals care about when we're thinking about well-being, we think about consumption, not income. Income allows you, affords you access to goods and services that you can consume. But consumption is the direct measure of well-being. So I want to try to convince you that income is really not the right concept for measuring poverty. And to do that, I'm going to introduce you to some people that might help me convey this. So this is Alex. Alex is a senior at University of Illinois. He's a Phi-Psi. His parents got him a BMW when he graduated from college. Alex lives off campus. His parents pay his rent. And he has a credit card. He just goes to the store, buys whatever he wants using his parents, living off the dime. I also want to introduce you to the Anthonys. Mrs. Anthony wrote some program for a dance in Fortnite and made a couple $2 billion, and then they retired and they now live off of the assets, the profits there. So they no longer work. And then I want to introduce you to the Millers. Mr. Miller has had some health issues, so he doesn't work. Mrs. Miller is a preschool teacher and makes about, she's in a high tax paying district, she makes about $30,000. Unfortunately, young Timmy has juvenile diabetes, and it's a really expensive medication. And so they often skip meals in order to make sure they can pay for his medication. So my question is, who's poor in these groups? So I have 3 different households. Which of these households would you say is poor under the official poverty measure, and which one is not poor? Yeah.
The Millers aren't doing so good.
Yeah, the Millers aren't doing so good, right? That's kind of probably the obvious one, right? What about according to the official poverty measure? Yeah.
None of them, because the top 2 don't have any income.
So the top 2 don't have any income, so that makes them income poor. So Alex, because he lives off his parents, and they just give him in-kind transfers, then he doesn't have any income. So when they compare his income to the poverty line, he's poor. They live off their assets, right? They don't have any income, and so when you compare them to the poverty line, they're poor. The Millers at $30,000 a year are just above the poverty line. So they're actually not poor, right? I guess it's a family of 5, so they're just above the poverty line then in recent years. So you can see that the income concept isn't really, like, our natural instinct is to think about the Millers, right? They are really struggling to make ends meet, but income misses that. Right? The income concept isn't quite right, and in economics we talk about how income can vary, but individuals and families will smooth consumption over variable income. Right? And so a much better way to capture well-being would be to think of their consumption. So you could, Alex might be income poor, but he's not consumption poor, right? He's probably living in a nice apartment, he's driving a nice car, spends a lot on leisure, obviously the same case for the Anthonys, right? But their consumption, their non-medical consumption would be really low, and we would capture that, and we could classify them appropriately as poor. Okay, so when you look at measuring poverty through consumption, does it give you a different story than when you look at income? Well, so what I'm going to do, this is that figure I already showed you. This is a correcting for inflation and correcting for income sources. Okay? And when you do that, we get a decline of 8 percentage points. What if instead of comparing income, I'm going to compare consumption? Right? And I'm going to make sure that the poverty rate in 1980 is the same. So I'm going to kind of calculate the thresholds that give me the same poverty rate in 1980, and then I'm going to see what happens when you look at consumption-based measure of poverty. And what you see is something that where we see even greater declines than we do with consumption, than we do with income. Right? So income is missing some of the changes, increases in well-being that we see when we look at consumption-based measure of poverty. Okay, so at this point you might be like, this all sounds plausible, but is he just smoke and mirrors, or is he just playing with the data, making things up, trying to get the data to fit a story he wants to tell? If you don't like my inflation bias adjustments, and you don't like fiddling with the poverty measure, let's look at other indicators of well-being and say, if you look at people at the bottom of the income distribution, in 1980 compared to today, do they look like they're better off, or do they look like they're worse off? Right, just to kind of get a sense that it's consistent with this story. So other indicators of progress. So if you look at the housing units, so I'm going to show you some data for people at the bottom 20% of the income distribution. If you look at housing units, they've gotten bigger. Over time, it's a 12% increase over this period in the number of rooms in the house. If you look at the fraction of those at the bottom of the income distribution that live in housing that has air conditioning, that has increased by nearly a factor of 3. If you look at the fraction of those at the bottom of the income distribution that own a car, that also has increased by more than 10%. If I could show you data on housing problems, whether or not the house has a leak, whether or not they feel unsafe, characteristic after characteristic. Low-income families, these other indicators of well-being suggest that they are better off. Now, to be clear here, I'm not making an argument that people at the bottom of the income distribution are well off. I'm making an argument that people in the bottom income distribution in 1980 were really bad. Right? And in 1964, they were even worse. Right? And so just because we continue to see people that are not doing well at the bottom income distribution does not mean that we haven't made any progress in the war on poverty. So the last, before I want to hear what your all's thoughts are and your questions, but I wanted to give you a sense of why. If my argument is that the data clearly show that we're winning the war on poverty, why are we winning the war on poverty? And the first question is, does it have anything to do with what Johnson did, right? And so we can look at some things, look at what are some policies that may have had a big effect. And in our broader research, we've looked at many different policies. And there's two that I'm going to highlight that have played a particularly important role in terms of reducing poverty in the United States. And I'm going to show you this in a fairly straightforward way. So the first one I'm going to show you is tax policy. And what I've done is, just like I corrected the poverty measures for differences in resources, I'm going to calculate two poverty rates, one each year, one that is pre-tax and one that's post-tax. Right? And so that, looking over time, that will tell us what the effect of the taxes has been on poverty. And there have been a number of different major pieces of tax reform. Probably the Tax Reform Act of 1986, they introduced or really expanded the earned income tax credit, and then it was expanded even further in the 1990s early 90s under Clinton. And the tax credit, the earned income tax credit for low-wage workers, if your tax liability was zero, you would actually get a payment from the government. So many low-wage workers in the United States, when they file their taxes, they actually get, the government pays them, not they're paying the government. So we are redistributing resources through the tax system now, through the IRS, and you can see as a result of those initiatives that the poverty rate incorporating taxes is declining faster than the one that doesn't. And so taxes alone can account for about a percentage point in the decline in poverty since 1980. Right? It's obviously not explaining everything, but it's an important part of the program. One that may be a little bit more surprising, because it's targeting a very small part of the distribution, it's the older individuals, is Social Security. So it turns out the way they calculate Social Security benefits, based on a price index that is a function of the cost of labor, Social Security benefits have increased faster than inflation over time. And it has had a real impact on poverty. So if you calculate a poverty rate on just money income, and then Social Security income is money income, I'm just going to take it out. So I take out your Social Security income and recalculate poverty. And when I do that, you see that poverty has fallen, it's about that's 4 percentage point difference in the decline in poverty as a result of Social Security, which is a really large, in the last 40 years, think about that as 12 million individuals just because of Social Security, and it's only targeting those in the high end of the distribution. In fact, one of the clearest things when you look at the data in terms of which groups have benefited the most, the elderly have seen the greatest improvements in economic well-being since the war on poverty was declared. And that, in large part, was because things were really bad in the 1960s for the elderly. So here, I calculated consumption poverty measure that is just for the elderly. And when you do that, you see that poverty rates were upwards of 45% back in the 1960s. Right? And since then, we've seen dramatic improvements in the fraction of the elderly that have resources below the poverty line. Social Security plays a really important role, but other incentives to improve savings for retirement have helped as well. And so we've seen this dramatic improvement. And before Social Security, we saw a lot of elderly who were struggling to put food on the table, and poverty was really high. Okay, so I've said a lot in a short amount of time, so let me kind of wrap up and then I'm going to turn it over to you. If you blanked out for a minute and the only thing you can take away is Cody Parkey missed a field goal, let me remind you of a few things. Okay, first is that we're winning the war on poverty, right? And the data are pretty conclusive on that in the United States today, those at the bottom, the fraction of the population that falls below a very low threshold is much lower than it used to be. And the reason why, the official measure gets it wrong, and the reason why it gets it wrong is because, for many reasons, but primarily because of this Buyse price index and as well as a flawed measure of resources. If you're looking at why did it fall, there is some of the decline can be accounted for by policy changes. And so I mentioned EITC, I mentioned Social Security. But if you're keeping track, you're like, there's a big part that's unexplained. Right? And so that's true. If you go through a lot of different policies, you can't explain all of the decline in poverty. And what that means is it leaves additional improvements to growth in the overall economy. So we've seen the increases in inequality, certainly in the United States. We've seen dramatic growth in the economy in the United States over the last 55 years. And it turns out that growth, although benefiting the top of the distribution more than the bottom, has also benefited the bottom. And so that clearly plays an important role. It's a natural question to ask, well, where do we go from here? If we're winning the war on poverty, where do we go? And I'll tell you that when we released these data and these results, some people jumped on it and said, oh, well, declaring on a war on poverty is largely over. The White House urges that we stop funding these aid programs, right? So this was in July of 2018, the Council of Economic Advisors report came out, and they cited our results and said poverty has really declined, and so there isn't the justification for more safety net programs. And so what we like to point out here is that poverty relative to the standards that were set in 1964 have declined, right? But what it means to be poor, or maybe a way to think about it is, what does it mean to be not poor in the United States today? It's something very different than what it means to be not poor in the United States in 1964. And it makes sense to change those. In other words, if we could call Molly Orshansky back and say, maybe we need to rethink where we draw the line, what it means to be poor in the United States, and then set that as a goal for guiding policy going forward. In other words, let's declare a new war on poverty where we can continue to make progress in improving economic well-being at the bottom of the distribution. And with that, I will stop and turn over to you for questions. Yes, Noah.
So, I guess to start us off, so like when you're talking about like inflation rise and how the poverty line has like been moved up, like what does that do to the families that you said it makes it harder for them to be considered above the poverty line? Is there any downsides for those families in terms of like benefits or downsides to like having that besides like the overall big issue?
Yeah, no, this is a really good point and speaks to why it's hard to change the poverty measure. So for my numbers, whether you're above poverty line or below the poverty line, where you are in a distribution shouldn't affect your, just below one point of distribution shouldn't affect your well-being. But it turns out, as Noah points out, that eligibility for a lot of government programs is determined by the poverty line. So the food stamps is, you have resources below 130% of the poverty line. And so eligibility for school lunch is typically 180% of the poverty line. So there are Medicaid, when they say expanding Medicaid, they've been moving that threshold for eligibility for Medicaid up to 200% of the poverty line, et cetera. So if you change the poverty line, so if you were to, if policymakers were to say, the Sullivan guy is right, we're gonna change the poverty line, if they did that, then you would cut millions of people off of benefits, right? And so and that people have used, that made that exact argument, but that's not our argument. Our argument is just, if you are asking the question, are you better off today than you were, 55 years ago, then you should make this adjustment. What the inflation bias has done has built in slightly expanded eligibility for federal government benefits over time. It's just built in because of the inflation bias. Now, that may not have been their intention, but you may or may not agree that should happen, right? So we're not saying that much of the argument is on poverty measurement is where the line should be drawn. And this is a very political question, because if you draw the line here, then only these people are eligible for government benefits. If you draw it here, then all these people are too, right? And that is a very different question than saying what's happened to well-being over time. And the drawing the line question is completely unscientific, right? It's arbitrary. You could make a case like Meyer or Shansky, okay, we want them to be able to afford food and a little bit of housing. You can make that case, but there's no line you can draw in the distribution where just a little bit above it, people are better off, and a little bit below it, people are clearly worse off, right? And so that ends up becoming a subjective question, and because of the structure of our government programs, so much government funding is tied to it. As soon as you say we want to change the poverty line, you get to political stalemate. Other questions?
So, what does it look like to actually win the war, the war on poverty? What's the actual goal of doing it? Instead of just calling it a war, what's the goal of the war?
So you mean what will we define as success? Is that?
Yeah.
So I think it's perfectly reasonable to say our goal is set a poverty rate. Let's drive that poverty rate to zero, right? And that should be a goal. And if we say we're in a high-income country, richest country in the world, we think that anybody that lives in this country should have a living standard at this point, and then have as a goal to make that happen, right? That is I think a reasonable thing to do. The trick is that it doesn't mean you're ever going to end poverty, right? Because for a lot of reasons, right? One, because our understanding of what it means to be poor has changed, right? Under the official definition, right? If you go back to 1890s, right? 98% of the country would have been poor, right? And but it was just a different lifestyle, different expectations about the standard of living, and those things change over time. You also have other things like immigration and barriers to self-sufficiency that are always going to create needs for how we're going to address the very bottom of the distribution. But I think it makes sense to set a goal that will guide policy to driving that to a very, very low number, and that's what they've done over the last 55 years, right? And so, what is our new standard? And nowadays it might be, well, how do we address the opioid crisis and inner city crime and juvenile recidivism rates? We might target those things and say our goal is to get to reduce those to close to zero.
Your studies of different measures that policy and those sorts of things are taken to attack poverty from different angles. You mentioned food stamps and housing assistance and all those things. Are there any specific areas that you see as really needing improvement still? These programs aren't as effective as they could be, or you can specifically target this area? So you sort of mentioned a little bit of that stuff, but is there any specific areas that come to mind when you think about ways of improving policy or programs?
Yeah, let me start on things that I think have gone really well. probably the program that receives the broadest support and has done really well is the earned income tax credit. And the reason is it redistributes a lot of money to the bottom of the distribution, and it does so in a context that incentivizes work. Right? So a big concern is if I say, I will, I'm going to guarantee income for everybody below a certain level to ensure that they're not in abject poverty. The problem is, are you disincentivizing that individual or family from working, in addition to it being a costly program. The earned income tax credit, you needed to work in order to, is a wage subsidy, so you needed to work in order to get it, and the more in the early part of the wage distribution, the more you worked, the larger your credit was. And so it redistributed a lot of resources to the bottom of the distribution. It's just kind of like a simple arithmetic exercise, shows that it lifts more children out of poverty than any of the other anti-poverty programs, and it's because it targets people right around the poverty line, right? So, and it's politically attractive because both conservatives and progressives have reasons to like it, right? In terms of things that haven't worked, I think I don't know about specific programs. I mean, we could argue about income guarantees, like whether or not that's a good thing. There was a lot of criticism, much of it unwarranted, a lot of criticism of the old welfare program that paid an income guarantee that when you didn't work, and then if you worked, you lost it, and if you were married, you would lose it. So it had a lot of incentives in it that weren't necessarily the ones that we wanted in there. I think a lot of welfare cannot be blamed for things like low marriage rates or high fertility rates outside of marriage and things like that. It turns out when you look at the effects of those programs, it's pretty small. But there still is clearly missing policy for unmarried men, in particular those in the inner city, and in particular Black Americans. And so we see very low employment rates, we see high incarceration rates, and so they're not eligible for really any of the programs that food stamps would be the one program that they would be eligible, because typically eligibility is focused on tied to a child. And so if there's a hole in the safety net, a glaring hole, that would be one of them, right? That for low educated, low income single males, there's a little support in the safety net for them. Okay.
Particularly on like a more urban concentrated focus, I'd like to know your thoughts on whether the federal government or municipal governments are better equipped to like combat problems like gentrification or displacement, or more specifically like inner city problems, particularly because it's been a problem since the mid 20th century. So there's obviously like stats that with that, but yeah, I'm not really familiar with kind of the differences between the two places.
Yeah, so I mean, the local level typically has had the authority to make decisions on zoning and factors that might affect migration or residential location decisions. The federal government, however, is, that's where the purse strings are. So if you want to think about major policies that might change the urban problems, the federal government could expand, or let's take housing subsidies and housing projects. So one of the blames for urban blight is that we built these housing projects, right? And that concentrated poverty in small areas. They became very high crime areas. The neighborhoods fell apart. Property values fell apart, right? And led to a lot of racial segregation as well. The federal government funded the public housing programs, and they have systematically shifted those away from public housing to was Section 8 housing, now housing choice vouchers. So now subsidies, which individuals can use to rent an apartment unit, it doesn't have to be a housing and urban development project. Because the federal government has access to all those resources, right, and they can really make big changes, right? They can really, at the local level, they are much more limited in terms of being able to make those big policy changes because they don't have the resources to do the redistribution that the federal government does.
Can you give us a notion of how big the income versus consumption measures differ from one another? Like, how many families look like those two families on the top, and how many families might we be missing by only measuring income rather than consumption?
Yeah, so in the overall count, we fix it so that at least one point in time, the fraction poor are the same, right? Because if I just took consumption and compared it to Meyer-Shansky's thresholds, the poverty rate would be really low because consumption is much less dispersed, right? And so there aren't as many people in the talent and consumption distribution. So what we do instead is, instead of using Meyer-Shansky's thresholds, we use a threshold that will make poverty rate the same in a given year, right? So we start with that point. And then your question is, how much of a difference does it make if we look at consumption? Now, let's keep the poverty rate the same, then if we look at income. And the biggest difference is in the composition of who is poor. And so it is true, maybe that's what you're getting at, that the Anthonys are an outlier, right? That there probably aren't many of them that's not really driving bias in it. I gave that as an example of so you can understand why you wouldn't want to use income. But what you do have a lot of are retired couples living off of Social Security and a lot of assets, right? And they would be viewed as poor in the official measure. But with consumption, as soon as you take the value of their house and calculate the service flows from the value of their house, now it's clear that they're not poor. And so when you look at a consumption measure, I showed you the elderly poverty rates and that sharp decline. That is unique to the consumption poverty measure. The progress, you capture the progress that's happened for the elderly in the United States more with consumption than income. When you look at a consumption-based measure of poverty, there are many more single moms and children and fewer elderly than you would with an income measure.
So to that, is there a way to restructure policy to provide eligibility based on any notion of consumption rather than income, or is that infeasible?
Yeah, so we've been asked this a lot. It's should we just base eligibility on consumption? That's really hard to do, right? You imagine people hide their income to get eligible for programs. I think people hide how they spend their money, and it's just much harder to verify for the purposes of eligibility. There are things that people have. I mean, there are strategies programs have taken, like look at their assets, right? To asset test. Those have been criticized just because we don't want to discourage the bottom of the distribution from saving, right? And so it's just in terms of implementing eligibility for programs, it's probably harder to do better than looking at their income sources, just because there aren't that many of the Anthonys that are getting government getting government benefits. All the way back.
Yeah, so you just mentioned the issue of single-parent households, and since the official start of the war on poverty under LBJ, the incentive structure kind of placed a priority on single-family households as opposed to two-parent households, and since then we've seen the number of single-parent households spike incredibly. And so I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit, like how they play into each other and what you think the proper solution to handling that would be.
Yeah, so policy's been blamed for this a lot, and it's easy to blame, this is what I was getting at with the discussion of welfare. It's easy to blame welfare because there was a very clear marriage penalty built into welfare. And the studies that have looked at this have, at least early on in welfare, so looking at welfare in the 1980s, by exploiting the fact that some states were more generous than other states in terms of welfare. Those studies indicate that the welfare program is unlikely to be a driving factor for single parenthood. Now, more recent studies have shown that welfare does move a little bit the needle on marriage. But when you look at what's happened to single parents and children born into single parent families over the past 50 years, that change is so much greater than anything that these kinds of problems could explain. And even if you look at the tax code, they talk about a marriage penalty in the tax code. Those penalties are just too small to explain the increases. And I mean, we have made some progress. I'm not sure we know why, but there was since the early 60s, there was a very sharp rise in teenage childbearing, and in the early 1990s, that just flattened out. And there's lots of hypotheses for why that is the case, but I don't think anybody says it's because of any changes in welfare policy. Yeah.
As broad a topic as this may be, I would just like to know how America's homeless population fits into this new war on poverty.
The homeless?
Yes.
Yes, so the homeless actually are not in any of these numbers, because the survey is the survey of addresses in the United States. The census measures the homeless, but we don't in our annual surveys. And so then we just have to think about that separately. And if you look at what's happened to homelessness in the United States, over a broad period of time, so I can't give it to you that broad because we didn't start really formally counting the homeless until like the mid-1990s. And if you look at those counts, they've been fairly steady to slightly declining. But the biggest shift has been the movement to homeless to certain cities. So New York, Seattle, San Francisco, LA have seen these sharp rises in homelessness, but across the country that we haven't seen that rise. But because the rise has been so sharp in these cities, homelessness policy is probably the single most important social policy issues in these cities, and there's lots of different initiatives that have been proposed. Perhaps the one that has the best evidence behind it is providing wraparound services along with the housing. Because if you provide just the housing or the shelter, these individuals tend to cycle in and out of the shelters and back on the streets and continue to be homeless. If you couple it, it's called permanent supportive housing. If you couple the housing with supportive services, mental health services, substance abuse services, etc., there's real evidence to show that can keep people stably housed for an extended period of time.
So they kind of fit into their own war, like war on homelessness?
Yeah, it would be. So they probably fall under the umbrella of war on poverty, but they literally aren't, they're just not measured here. Right. But yes, the policies themselves would fall under the broader umbrella in social policy. Jason, you have a question?
So you motivate very nicely with the LBJ, war on poverty, and then it looks like we're losing the war on poverty because poverty is not reducing, it's not getting reduced very much, right? It says poverty is because of war. And you've shown, no, in fact, poverty is reducing quite nicely. But then, as you say, there's a lot of it's unexplained. Like, it could be both. Like, you've said, oh, we're winning the war on poverty, but what you've really shown is poverty's fall. But if you motivate with LBJ and all the big government stuff, then it's a little bit of a bait switch, right? Like, it's not clear. I mean, as you pointed out, that like those big government programs are driving down poverty, as opposed to economic growth, right? So maybe just like poverty is losing, but not to the war on poverty.
Well, if the war on poverty was to reduce poverty in the United States, we're winning the war on poverty. If the war on poverty is these government programs, right, I think this is your point, were those government programs a success? We're not necessarily saying that, although you can clearly show that expansion of the tax credit, Social Security have played an important role. So there's some components where you can show that that's the case. And it may be the case that poverty has fallen in spite of all the bad that these other programs have done, right? That we can't reject that, because we don't know how much that economic growth has, overall has played. But
We suspect it's a lot.
But
We
the,
suspect it's a lot.
yeah, it's, I mean, I'm leaving 66% of it there to be unexplained already, so it's gonna be a lot. But it's also important to note that there are programs that have been shown to directly lead to reductions in poverty, and that have been sustained.
And I think particularly if you talk about targeted force, like on elderly, or like what we're
Yes.
seeing now with child poverty.
Mhm.
If you just mail parents checks, that's great for
That's-
child poverty.
That is, it turns out that if you give people income, it raises their income and it reduces poverty. It's, yes, it is, but then people ignore that we could have done that all along, right? I've heard people make the argument, why don't we just take the $1 trillion we spend and then divide it up and spread it out to the 38 million individuals that are poor, and we could lift them all to the poverty line. Overnight, I got rid of poverty, right? But that ignores the fact that not every poor individual or household is the same. Some of them are on Medicaid, require dialysis, or some things are really expensive, some things are not, and so it's not so simple as that, right? It's not so simple. Yeah.
It's hard for me to ask my question because of the political nature of these programs. But I'm curious in terms of, I understand what you're saying from an economic standpoint, how these programs are lifting people out of poverty. But I'm thinking, I don't know if it's like I'm a social worker, and from like a more like a social perspective or maybe a philosophical perspective, like to call those people not poor when they're still dependent on these programs, like how are there measures of like how, like, to me the war on poverty would be like, the argument would be stronger if like people were actually exiting those programs, not because of the threshold going up or down, but because they are no longer dependent.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's a really important point. That's one of the reasons why the EITC is getting so much support politically from both sides, is because it's moving people above the poverty line and moving them into working off of government resources, right? So it's got that's your idea. There are some that argue that the measure of income that we use should be non-transfer income. So we should, kind of going back to the Molly Orshansky thing, we should use the measure of resources free from support from the federal government. Maybe we include taxes, right? That would be the one thing that we would add. And I think that has to be an important part of the story, right? That if you're measuring the success of a federal safety net, it shouldn't be that the goal is to get everybody out of poverty through the federal safety net. That my story I just told about, let's just give everybody enough money to get out of poverty, then that would be the solution. But if you value self-sufficiency and the dignity of work, then and people's ability to thrive independent of government support, then you obviously want that to be part of the metric as well. And so I would agree. I would say that we need to be when thinking about how well we're doing in terms of social policy. It's lifting people out of poverty, but also how many people are out of poverty in a way that means they're independent of government programs.
Do you have data on that off the top of your head in terms of how many people are exiting welfare, not because of the policy changing, but because of their own personal familial economic growth?
Yeah, I have the data on people exiting welfare, which was a tremendous number, right? When they reformed welfare, the caseloads plummeted. In Texas today, like 2% of the eligible population from the old days are on welfare now. So it's a really small fraction. I just don't know how much of it's because of work or because it's no longer an entitlement that you.
Are those things like, but does that data exist?
Yeah, you could calculate that.
You mentioned the inflation measure getting overhauled.
Mm-hmm.
Can you go a little more into like how they realized our inflation measure is completely wrong, and then what changed for the person?
Yeah, so let me give you, there's some parts that are complicated, some parts that are not. So the simplest one is they use a representative basket. Okay, and so they just take the representative basket and they price it, and how much did that basket increase in prices over time? And it took them 10 years to get the cell phone in the representative basket, right? And what happened, and think about the kinds of goods that enter the basket, right? Computers, new technology. They're all really high priced when they enter, and then their prices fall, right? So the new goods that innovate to become cheaper is missed in the way they used to calculate. They now try to update the basket every 2 years, right? So that's one innovation that they made. The other is this idea of concept we call substitution bias, which is that if there are two goods that are very similar, and the price of one good goes up that you were buying. So let's suppose this good, the way I think about it is Tropicana and Florida is all, what's the orange juice you like? Florida's best, whatever, you used to drink, right? Florida, two orange juices, right? So Florida's best is...
I don't drink that stuff anymore.
Yeah, oh, you used to.
It's just water and ice.
Yeah, that, suppose the Florida's best is in the basket, and the price of it goes up and you switch to Tropicana, right? Are you worse off? No, unless you think that one's clearly better than the other, right? So if the price of one goes up, you can substitute into the cheaper good. And the way they used to calculate it didn't account for the ability to substitute into close substitutes that were at a lower price. And there is a way to account for that to some degree, and they've now incorporated that into the pricing. So those are two of the big. There's also one that they don't include Walmarts and Costco's. It's only grocery stores and some other things that led for them to not capture a lot of the price savings that have accrued to households over time. Yes?
Does the measurement of consumption that kind of you proposed, does that introduce any new group and make them like see not poor when they are poor?
So there's one criticism that we've gotten that I think is somewhat legitimate, that might fall into this category. And that would be people who, because of, say, maybe we care about well-being as a relative thing, and so they're trying to keep up with the Joneses, and so they leverage their credit cards and they borrow in order to consume more, to makes them look like so now your consumption is high, but you're one credit report away from getting all of it repossessed and you're poor again. So if the extent that you're leveraging yourself to increase consumption, that would maybe the consumption is overstating your actual well-being. And so that would be one concern, but it turns out that consumption does a better job of capturing access to credit than does income, right? So like if you are able to access to credit to borrow to purchase a home can be a really good thing, right? And you will see that in a consumption measure if it allows you to consume things, whereas you wouldn't see that in an income measure. So it's not clear in that case that's necessarily that. You can go a couple more questions. You go okay, yeah.
So you mentioned in your example that was like highlighting the difference between consumption versus income, and like the benefits of that measure. That the one family had a lot of excess medical bills that you have to exclude when you go to that. I'm curious if that was included in your like data about using consumption overall, and if that's like a possible system considering like HIPAA and healthcare privacy laws and things like that.
Yeah, so there are, when we're constructing a measure of consumption, we have to make some decisions about what to include. And one of the kind of areas of debate is whether or not we should include out-of-pocket medical expenses. And the reason why you would want to include them is if it's, plastic surgery, right? And the reason why you wouldn't, because that's, it's correlated with increasing utility. And the reason why you wouldn't want to include it is if it's, indicator of bad health, right? And in the case of thinking about poverty, we think the argument's much stronger that out-of-pocket medical expenses are not adding to increasing utility, and so that we probably want to exclude them from our measure of consumption. In terms of privacy, we don't have to worry about those things because these are, we build our consumption measure based on survey data. And so they go into the households and they say, how much do you spend on rent, how much do you spend in the grocery store, how money do you spend in the doctor's office, et cetera. And so they report those data and then we have access to them. Okay, yeah, Alex.
So many high-income countries, they actually set their property line like using a relative property measure, right? So UK and EU in general, and Australia, thinking about the median household income, right? And then maybe 40 or 50 or 60% of that.
Yep.
Of course, adjusting for the household size in order to sell a property. I just looked at the data, like in the US, the average, so the median household income is slightly below $70,000 per year for family. And if we think about like 50% of that, right, or 40%, that we're talking about like either 28,000 or maybe 35,000, right? If we go by that measure, like what is the property rate like in the US, and how do we compare among the class of like high income countries? Are we doing better or not?
Yeah, so a relative measure of poverty, you take it's a much simpler way to do the thresholds. You take the median and then you specify the threshold as some percent of the median. Say 60% of the median. If you're below 60% of median income, then you're poor. And in the United States, we have greater inequality than in most industrialized countries. As a result, we're going to have greater dispersion at the bottom of the distribution, and a relative poverty measure, we're not going to look so good. Let me make a couple comments about relative poverty, because I'm glad you brought that up. So some people say, oh, we should just do a relative poverty measure. Now notice that a relative poverty measure builds in an increase in it moves the goalposts too, right? It's built in because the median income's rising because we have economic growth, so the threshold, 60% of the median income is also rising over time, right? Now, I'm fine with a relative poverty measure as long as you acknowledge that what it's capturing is inequality. And what it's not capturing, and should never be used for, is a metric for whether or not we're better off today than we were 50 years ago. Right? And my favorite example of that is that Ireland uses a relative measure of poverty, and Ireland experienced the most unprecedented period of growth in the early 2000s, both for Ireland and then across Europe, and its poverty rate went up. And its poverty rate went up because the median kept going up, which raised the threshold as median went up. And so the relative poverty measure isn't going to do a good job of comparing absolute levels. Are we making progress over time? But in terms of measuring dispersion, inequality at the bottom of the distribution, it's a good measure to have. Who's people who have asked questions? Yeah.
In terms of, it seems like it's got to be highly context dependent, and the big thing that seems to be driving poverty these days is housing prices, which also increase with economic growth, and of course are highly variable from place to place. So how does a measure of income, measure of poverty, take into account, especially if it's done at a national level, take into account the big differences that are going to exist in terms of how far an income can go in a particular place, particularly though in relation to housing, which can create all kinds of instability and social problems that sort of cascade from housing instability.
Yeah, this is a really contentious area of debate right now for reforming the poverty measure. So the resources point that I made, that everybody agrees with, right? So if we were to come up with a new measure of poverty, it would include all those things. The census, recognizing a lot of the flaws, releases its own income measure that's called the supplemental poverty measure. And in that, they change the poverty line by geographic area depending on the local prices. So it's a geographical price index adjustment to the threshold. What that means is poverty rates in New York and California are much, much higher, right? And all of a sudden, we typically thought of Mississippi's of the world being the poorest states in the country, and their poverty rates are much, much lower. And so there's a lot of reasons why we think we should do that. The pushback is that the differences in the price levels reflect other differences, including differences in wages and differences in access to amenities, and maybe that's capturing certain indicators of well-being. And so that you don't want to be correcting for that. And I don't think that there's a clear answer one way or the other. When you do those geographic adjustments, it doesn't change the US poverty rate all that much. What it does is change dramatically where the poverty is occurring. You could imagine it having a really big effect on government, if you did government programs that way though, right? Now all the benefits would go to big cities, and poor rural areas would get much, because they'd have lower poverty rates, would be much fewer.
In general, like is property in the States kind of like more sticky in the way that like the property spell or property duration longer compared to other countries or countries?
So I don't know the cross-country comparisons on the duration of poverty. So 40% of individuals in the United States will experience a spell of poverty, meaning that they were in poverty for 1 year during their lifetime. Even though only about 12% are poor at a given point in time. So there's a lot of cycling in and out of poverty. But there is a big chunk, right, so that think of it as about just under half that are what we call more of the chronic poor, that when we're measuring their resources, regardless of how we do it, they're going to be categorized as poor year after year after year. That is very strongly correlated with things like education and your ability to earn a wage in the labor market that would be able to get you out of poverty. Should we do one more? One more question, yeah. Yeah, it's here. Take us home.
What fraction of the poverty, do college students count?
Yes.
What fraction do college students make up of?
So it turns out that college students are a very low fraction, because when I say they count if they're off campus, and therefore head of a household, right? So if you're in a dormitory, then you're kind of viewed as part of your family back home, right? But because a couple of things. One, because once they're off campus, that's a smaller fraction of the college population, and many of those do have means to put them above the poverty line. They're a very small fraction of so you could say it's a criticism of my example, right? Because the example I gave you of Alex is not a very common example. What it is a very obvious one, right? We should not have a concept that allows that, even if it's rare, to allow that person to be classified as poor. Thank you so much for the questions.